All right, everyone. Welcome back to a Esoterica live stream here, and at least where I'm at, a really beautiful, almost fall-like afternoon. It's really great. I'm looking forward to spooky season, fall time, whenever that starts for you, and according to your Hillcoat autumn. But I'm really happy to be joined by Dr. Dan Atrell, the modern hermeticist. Dan, thank you for taking some time to hang out with me again and with these fine folks here.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Of course. I just also want to remind folks, Dan, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, as a modern hermeticist, has been putting out grade A academic content on topics in Western esotericism for years, way before esoterica was even a thing in my eye, whatever that thing is. And I just want to say that Dan's opened recently started a Patreon account and providing access to stuff early and standard Patreon stuff. But I know that a lot of folks who are esoterica fans have benefited from Dan's work over the years and will continue to benefit from his work going forward. So I would really recommend for the folks who benefited from Dan's work to check out his Patreon. Do even retroactively support him for all the great work he's done in the past. That's totally within the realm of possibility, and also doing that work here in the future. So, Dan, I just want to say thank you for the work of really pioneering the academic study, the scholarly study of Western esotericism here in the lonely years of doing that. So, thank you, Dan, for that work.
Thanks, Justin. I mean, I don't know if I can take credit for pioneering anything, but at least being there as a strong voice, I think that I could take credit for that at least.
I mean, you should take credit for all that you can in these ridiculous world. So, folks, there's kind of two things I want to do today, and it's to be a relatively short live stream. But there are two kind of things that I think Dan and I want to focus on. One of them is just sort of reflecting on our work on Reuchlin and sort of private correspondence with Dan. I think I mentioned to him that we've kind of cornered the Reuchlin market, at least at this point, in terms of content. Much more so than even the Wikipedia articles, I would say, have far less information on Reuchlin, and especially the esoteric side of his work, which are his published works, than our YouTube channel content, which just shows folks that you should, always remember that Wikipedia is a great resource, but at the end of the day, knowledge is really diffused in a lot more ways than Wikipedia. Um, and two, what I would like to open and chat about with both maybe some of the comments from the community chat, but also the chat here and with Dan, is just this question that I sort of opened, where one of the weird anomalies that I've noticed on my channel is that Renaissance era esoteric topics actually underperform compared to basically almost everything else, with one exception. And that one exception is anything highlighting a woman, which we know why that performs poorly, because of internet misogyny, probably. But aside from women, stuff focusing on women, which is always performs the worst, sadly, the next worst is Renaissance stuff, which when I looked at that, I was really shocked at, actually. And one of the things that I was telling Dan earlier is that I don't have a Renaissance esotericism playlist. I'm going to make one, but it was actually more interesting that because I don't have one, those individual episodes kind of floated on their own without being united in a way, aside from the fact they all had Renaissance in their title and they all performed relatively poorly compared to other things. And I just noticed that was conspicuous and asked you guys what you thought about why that might be. And I saw that it was a lot of really great comments about why folks thought that was. So I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to comment on that question. And yeah, I think give both Dan and I, because Dan, this is also really in your wheelhouse. So it's really grist for the mill of you making content about this area that you have an enormous amount of expertise in. And so I just want to thank folks for adding that stuff. But
Yeah, that was a lot. Like, people
mhm.
gave a lot of comments. I read through a good deal of them, but there were like what, 3, 4, 500 of them. So
Yeah, it was like, yeah, I think it was approaching 400 comments, which is great, because that shows that people are equally perplexed, and yet there's a sort of a vocal group of people clearly that are interested, but also it's still, the objective data is still there, that there's a overall disinterest in that. But maybe we can hit the Reuchlin stuff first, Dan, and then we can do the more Renaissance stuff, because I think we're going to spend more time on the Renaissance side of things. But so what am I doing the Beyonce? Okay. What do folks Dan, what did you anything coming away from the Reuchlin material, once you did a lot more work than I did? What any kind of stuff coming away from the Reuchlin material did you come away, I don't know, illuminated by, or looking at in a different light, or having done so much work in the Renaissance itself, did you come away with a new appreciation for Reuchlin, or what have you? Any post Reuchlin ideas?
So one of them was that I think, because I've been so knee deep in the Pico studies stuff lately, was that I realized how much Christian Kabbalah in and of itself is a Kabbalah, in the sense that it's a tradition and it is handed down from one author to another in a way. Like, it wasn't really this nebulous cloud. It actually had names in a tradition that these authors could say that such and such was influential in the making of this book. And Pico just really does get standing ovation and gets named outright. And we often think of Pico's Kabbalah as being somewhat superficial. That might be because we don't all understand it in the way that he wanted it to be understood, because all we get is these little mysterious conclusions. We don't get an actual treatise on what he believed. We have to wait for Reuchlin to get to that. But he was quite explicit in the De Arte Kabbalistica. I don't think I mentioned it in the video, but there's a whole section where the character of Simon the Jew mentions this Count Giovanni, who had great knowledge in all of these matters. So he makes it into the dialogue as a character. So
in De Verbo too, he's mentioned as the wonderful philosopher.
Yes.
So he's mentioned there as well, although not directly named, but he's referenced there. Although I think by the time of De Verbo, he had just gotten kind of rehabilitated, and so I think Reuchlin was still a little radioactive for Reuchlin.
Yeah, and that's the year he died as well. So I imagine when Reuchlin wrote the De Verbo, he was still alive. So that's interesting, because obviously you get this clear jump from Pico to Reuchlin, and Reuchlin to Agrippa, and then Agrippa onward to everyone. And so that's a really important linchpin in this tradition of textual interpretation. And I think that in doing this project, we kind of brought that to light, that this is not just like, it didn't come out fully formed from the head of Agrippa, but he's drawing from a wide array of influences, particularly in his super celestial account of things.
Yeah, and you can really see that in the, I think, lesser read 1510 Juvenile Draft, where Reuchlin's all over it, like quoted verbatim, all over the 1510 draft. And I think, as I mentioned, in 1509, Agrippa is lecturing publicly on Reuchlin's De Verbo. So he has Reuchlin on the mind all through the composition of at least that early fundamental strata of the three books. And so and again, I think it's also important to think of him not just as a chain linking Italy and Northern Europe, but also he's really in many ways filling out, maybe because of conversations he had with Pico, he's really filling out a lot of the stuff that we see in the conclusions, but really filling them, not like filling them out in terms of like really explicating them. And one wonders to what degree that is reflective of what Pico really thought. One could believe that it is, considering they actually hung out and talked. But regardless, Reuchlin, but also Reuchlin's transforming the stuff as it goes. So it's not just copying things from Pico, but really adding to it in his own way and things like that. So yeah, and I think the idea that saying that, no, this is a tradition. It is like a mouth to mouth, literally teacher to student tradition in the Christian world is really, really true, especially with Pico and Reuchlin, literally.
Another thing that was interesting was that from the De Verbo Mirifico to the De Arte Kabbalistica, really the theme of both books is the same. Like the power of the wonder working word
Right.
remains constant throughout that 2 decade long period, but it's how he's dealing with those texts and how he is confronting that information and representing that information that takes a very obvious shift. And I think that that's also something that's worth noting from one work to the next, because again, these aren't the kinds of things that you'll see in the Wikipedia article. They won't talk about these kinds of larger patterns or trying to place things in context. They'll just link you away to another page to discuss another thing, which is fine and has its merits, but it's important to unpack this from within its own context.
Right. I don't think there even is a Wikipedia article on De Verbo actually yet. But not going to get in the business of writing Wikipedia articles.
Yeah, no.
There's
no payoff for it, really.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of reasons.
And someone can just come along and undo what you wrote, so why bother?
Yeah, I guess I'd much rather do the YouTube stuff where at least it's out there and it's it's at least as reliable as I can conceivably have made it.
Yeah, and someone can argue with you in the comments instead of deleting your work and just papering it over with their own.
Right, you're right, with whatever bizarre things people come up with. Although the great thing about some of this stuff is it's not translated, so it's even hard for people to come up with bizarre stuff. Not that prevents people from doing that with Kabbalah, as we talked about earlier with stuff in the Klipot, which half of the great books about the Klipot aren't translated from Hebrew, and that doesn't stop completely insane people from making things up. But yeah, I guess also for me, when I'm working on De Verbo, was just like putting myself into the shoes of the readership of that book in the the 1490s, and thinking about that moment when Baruchia says, yeah, like there are all these hidden traditions, and the Jews also have one of these hidden traditions going back to Moses, and it's this thing called Kabbalah. And thinking to myself, especially in Northern Europe in a Christian context, someone reading that book for the first time, that might have been one of the first times they'd ever even heard about this idea, that the Kabbalah by the 1490s was just kind of, just barely, and really only in the Italian context, kind of getting out of the Jewish world to where Christians could get some access to it. But by the time this hit printing, even in those early days of the incunable printing, I think people would have gotten their hands on that and really thought to themselves, oh my goodness, what in the world is he talking about? We have to go look at this more. And I think of like Reuchlin in many ways having, because the conclusions, Pico's conclusions weren't widely printed. I mean, they weren't like, this wasn't like a widely accessible text. Even finding versions of it now are really hard. It was not a widely distributed text, but I think De Verbo was much more widely distributed and popular. I mean, people are picking it up and reading, Agrippa and other people. And I think that in many ways was sort of the Madonna moment in early Christian Kabbalah, where this thing had just gotten discovered in some ways, and there was sort of a mad dash to figure out what it was.
The Madonna moment.
For better or worse. I'm trying to upplay Madonna.
Like the Streisand effect, but the Madonna effect for Kabbalah.
The Madonna effect, that when she shows up with the red armband or whatever, he was like, oh, the Kabbalah, let's do that. So I think that that's sort of a watershed moment. And it's just interesting also to think of a moment where things like Kabbalah were new, where, that I'm so steeped in a world in which this is just part and parcel of what I read every day for whatever reason. I think the idea there was a moment where this was like off the presses and people were like, oh, the Jews have a secret tradition? Well, damn. I think that's just, and it unlocks the mysteries of all these things and blah, 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 blah. I think putting ourselves back into the minds of the young Agrippa, and the moment when the young Agrippa must have read De Verbo for the first time. I mean, it clearly made a very powerful impression upon him. And I think in some level probably altered the course of his intellectual career, or at least that kind of book did. So I just don't know. There's a humbling effect to not be so jaded that we just think, oh yeah, there's all this stuff, as opposed to being, oh yeah, this was new at one point, and it really set off an intellectual firestorm, and really that lasted all the way till now, and really getting into that, I think, is it puts you in an interesting headspace, I think.
Yeah. And speaking of Firestorm, Reuchlin tells us that his intentions in publishing the De Arte Kabbalistica was because of the Reuchlin Pfefferkorn
Right.
affair, and that
Absolutely.
people are trying to burn the Talmud and so on and so forth. And so he's thinking, if we need to preserve this knowledge that is mostly oral and in these books that people are burning, I need to, get this stuff out. I need to print it, and then I need to have it widely distributed, and that way it won't be destroyed. So
Right.
that is part of his aim in doing this as well. But of course, he's got his own Catholic twist on it, which
Right.
can't be, dismissed or anything like that. But
Sure. But
but it is
a unique Catholic twist, though, too. It's not Reuchlin's a weird kind of like Catholic, but certainly, um, I mean, yeah, Catholic, but also like really faith oriented. Like that's a big part of his theology. And I think what is his nephew or great nephew, Melanchthon, who
yes,
became like a, he's not well known now, but he's like a super big deal in the early Protestant world.
yep,
So he's certainly not Protestant, but he's at least there's some theological elements that are at least Protestant adjacent. I think that also explains why he ends up being much more copacetic to Northern European esotericism and stuff like that. So that's just another avenue that we could look down. Is sort of the more broad eagle's eye view of his theology and how that really how he had a much more his impact was bigger because of his broad-mindedness, both in terms of toleration at some level from the Jews, but also his much more Protestant adjacent kind of theology, despite the fact that he never left the Catholic Church and had no interest apparently in leaving. So any thoughts on Reuchlin before we turn to this more vague Renaissance topic?
not that come to mind immediately, but perhaps while we talk, something we can circle back around. Or
Yeah, I hope so. Well, folks, I hope that folks did find the Reuchlin material useful. I hope that you found it illuminating. Just that, again, I think many people think that we've sort of trod all the ground that is to be trod of the early modern esotericism, Renaissance esotericism. But I would argue that we're just now really getting into really good scholarship about it. I mean, this new Copenhagen book on Pico, I think it's gonna set the stage for another generation of scholarship at some level. And it's just now that we're really getting any apparati to understand people like Pico. And so I would say that folks don't be jaded about what's been done, and also don't think it's done. That there is so much work to be done in this field. And we mentioned people like Reuchlin or Lazzarelli, but there are tons of texts of early Christian Kabbalists that are not even translated, much less systematic analysis of their life and times and things like that. So absolutely the case. Just folks should know that there's still a ton of work to be done. Any of that stuff that really jump out to you, Dan, that you really would love to see in terms of characters from that time period?
you mean in terms of like people doing scholarship, or
Christian Kabbalists that don't get, Reuchlin gets a bit more, but there are others that I don't know if there's anyone that
yeah,
jumps out
I
at
mean,
you as
I'm trying to do this work on Arcangelo of Borgonovo, who is a Franciscan who worked from the works of Reuchlin and from not Menachem Recanati, sorry. Who's the other guy? The Christian Converso, who, anyways, it's not coming to me. He wrote the the Celestial Agriculture is the name of the work, and Arcangelo basically was defending Pico's theses against the accusations of Garcias.
right,
So
which
we
is
have
also another thing that's not. I don't think Garcias's reply to Pico has ever been translated.
no, and
Which
so
is
I'm working on the Apologia of Arcangelo, which is responding to Garcias's accusations against Pico. So it's kind of like YouTube commentary wars when people like make response videos on each other's videos, and then it just becomes this fractal of people commenting on each other's stuff. That's what Arcangelo is, but he's interesting because he's a 16th century friar, a Scotist, and he's also into Ficino's Platonism. He's into the Hermetica, like Lazzarelli's Hermetica, as well as Ficino's Hermetica. It talks about the Asclepius all the time. And he's into Kabbalah in its kind of newly reborn form, thanks to Reuchlin. Mm-hmm. So you really get this like firsthand account of people dealing with Reuchlin and Pico's material in the 16th century. And, you know, very obscure. Nobody works on this stuff, but it's out there. You can read it on Google Docs, as far as I know. If you can read the Latin, like Google Docs, not Google Docs, Google
or archive.org also
books,
just has
huge quantities of untranslated, undealt with materials that if you have the language skills to do it, go for it. And even if you don't translate all of it, you can leave breadcrumbs for other people to come later, and that's still a great service. You never know. You might write a few blog posts and then wind up in someone's like thank you in their book a few years down the line or something like that.
That's true.
At least in their bibliography.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was looking at the Garcia stuff because Reuchlin is also answering Garcias in his, like, he seems to know about some of Garcias's beef with Pico and seems to be answering in De Verbo, which is interesting. And there's some debate. Zika actually says it's not clear how much Reuchlin knew about Garcias's critique, but the way that Reuchlin answered some of the questions seems like he has exactly that critique in mind. They could have come to it independently or whatever.
Could just be in the air, yeah.
Yeah, so it's specifically about how the wonder-working world or any of these wonder-working words gets the power, which is a big critique Garcias has. He just thinks that it's arbitrary, basically. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Garcia stuff is really, really fascinating because it's just in the air of like what the critiques and what was at stake in these debates and you know what you stood to lose. I mean, Pico really could have gotten in a lot more trouble had that gone over differently.
It's like if today you had a rogue scholar who is very controversial and then is thrown out of the universities, and then you have like maybe not the dean, but a council of scholars appointed by the Pope to come together and analyze this rogue scholar's thoughts and tell you why he's wrong. That's kind of what it is. So it really gives you a snapshot of, you know, the 1489 or I think 88, sometime around there, what was in the air and what people believed was acceptable, orthodox, proper theology, and what was not. And, you know, there are 900 of these theses. You would think that there would be more than 13.
Yeah, it was only 13 that got really, and it was mostly the magic and Kabbalah ones that really got.
Theological stuff like that was like, no, we've agreed on this. Like, you're not reinventing the wheel. This is how it is.
Right. Yeah, and it's and he's all of like what 20 or something at the time. He's in his early 20s?
I don't know. He dies at 31, and so that's in 94. So if we count back, he would be like in his late 20s at that point.
Still an incredibly young guy when you think about it. It's an interesting question from Andrew Kuiper, I guess is how I'll pronounce it. It's a question that maybe you and I might have some insight to. Was Joseph Viterbo the first Christian Kabbalist to investigate the Shekhinah at length, even though Pico and Reuchlin have access to the Zohar already?
Okay, so they don't.
They don't. Yeah, that's going to be my answer. They don't have access to the Zohar. I think that is.
So what we know from Chaim Wierzbowski's studies of Pico's material is that all that Pico knew from the Zohar came from Menachem Recanati's commentaries. And so that's where it's coming from. And whereas like Aegidius of Viterbo is dealing with the Zohar directly, Pico is dealing with it through commentaries. And I think it's the same with Reuchlin. As far as I can tell, he's not dealing with the Zohar directly.
He never quotes it to my. No, it's not in De Verbo. I don't think he ever quotes it. And people should remember that the Zohar and the Sefer Yetzirah aren't going to be printed until like the 50s and 60s. So by the time Reuchlin and Pico are writing in the 1580s and 90s, it's still 60 years from the core Kabbalistic texts even getting printed. So of course they circulated in manuscript, but yeah, I don't think that I just don't think they have access to them.
Yeah, they had access to the Sefer Yetzirah.
No, right. So there was, yeah. So he does have it, in Mithridates, his translation, or one of those guys. But yeah, this stuff is still years out from being printed, which again just makes it that much more fascinating that they have access to what they do.
Yeah. I had a note that I wanted to throw out there for Zevi, and it is that in the De Arte Kabbalistica, Reuchlin says that Maimonides says something. I forget exactly what it is that he's saying. And he says, and the Kabbalists also think this, which signals that Reuchlin, unlike Pico, did not think Maimonides was a Kabbalist. And that's a big difference between those two guys. And I think that's an important note to make. At least that came out to me. I could be wrong on that. I could find another Reuchlin quote suggesting that he was a Kabbalist, but as far as I can tell, he thought he made that distinction between Maimonides' philosophy and then the Kabbalah itself as Jewish mysticism.
Interesting, yeah. The debate over people trying to claim Maimonides as their own, everybody wants a piece of that guy. So it's just like a great, I don't know, the way that develops is always hilarious to me. And everyone has very strong feelings about it. It's funny that this guy, who's otherwise, like, the Geitherplex is such a boring book to read. It's just such a slog. At least the first two books are such a slog, and that it could generate such controversy. Just shows you that people back then are very different than people. Like, the intellectual things that bother people are nothing like they are now. You couldn't even convince someone to read that stuff hardly. I don't know.
But don't you think, in terms of Maimonides, some of the controversy was that he wanted to make a one-stop shop, and that in and of itself was controversial. And I think that still is controversial today, where people are like, you can't just have this meta-narrative that has everything containing it, or one book or encyclopedia or whatever. Like, everything has its limits.
Well, the Mishneh Torah, they didn't like the fact that he didn't like, basically they didn't like the fact that he didn't quote his sources and stuff. That's what really made people angry. There was no apparatus for questioning it, basically. So that was a part of why the Mishneh Torah wasn't super well received. That's to put it mildly. But I think part of the people really didn't have to read between the lines with the guide. I mean, if you read it literally and you don't buy the whole Straussian idea that there's this esoteric dimension behind it, if you read it just straight up, it's aside from maybe the Wars of the Lord by Gersonides, it's a pretty radical text approaching a rationalism that we wouldn't see until Spinoza. And so I think that people were upset about it for totally legit reasons. And especially in the context of Spain and stuff, where people really were facing the threat of converting. And if it were just like the idea that this is all this intellectual stuff and angels and demons are metaphors and all this stuff is metaphors, that opens the door to making conversion much, much easier. And the hardcore religious reactionaries who were having to deal with those mass conversions really did not want their doctors and intellectuals and other these people basically switching teams because it's all just metaphors or something. So I think that it was also just part of like the existential angst that existed, that philosophy opens the door to everything being metaphors. And if everything's a metaphor, then why not be a Christian? You get to have your land and maintain your job and, whatever. So I think that that was also militating in a strong way, what was motivating the hardcore hatred on Maimonides, which makes sense to me. I mean, so, and can you see this in the Zohar? People forget Moshe de Leon had a copy of the God That Perplexed written out for him. It survives. We have his copy of the God That Perplexed. It's in the library in Moscow, whatever. And he marks through it very carefully the parts that really make him angry. And many of the parts that make him angry, or the parts you can see him really disliking, those sections get reversed basically and end up grist for the mill for the Zohar. So in some ways, not in total ways, but in many ways, it's a kind of like, you say God can't have a body? Well, let me tell you about God's body for 3 volumes in the Zohar. So it becomes very much grist for the mill for that. But I'm going to jump over to talk about some of the Renaissance stuff for a second, or for half an hour maybe.
Yep.
All right. Well, again, I just want to thank everyone for the time they took to comment. There was many really great comments about this question of what about the Renaissance like turns people off. And of course, I threw the gauntlet down and made the argument that a big part of it is just that many people get into esotericism, I think, because they got burned at some level by Christianity. And because they sort of got burned by Christianity and kind of got into esotericism as a part of an anti-Christian, or at least a non-Christian
post-Christian reaction,
that the idea of going back into a world that is intensely Christian just doesn't sit well with them, for reasons that make sense. If you've been traumatized by a religious institution, that makes total sense to me. Having been traumatized by Christian hegemony, I can get down with you. But that's weird, I think, at least for a couple of reasons. One of which is people still love Agrippa. And Agrippa is like, and John Dee, who are still well within the scope of Christianity, a weird kind of Christianity, but Christianity is the same. So, but I'm curious. I think that was one of the things that jumped out at me. And I guess my concern about that is, for folks who make that move, I would just encourage people that realizing the crappy things about Christian hegemony are one thing, and even coming to a post-Christian spirituality is another thing. But again, I'm always worried about the baby out with the bathwater dilemma, where one could dislike these things, but then implicitly toss out Pico or Ficino or whatever, Reuchlin or whatever, because you sort of do that. And I think that while I don't have I'm not there to find Christian truths, I'm still there to sort of grab our nose when we get, or still there to grab into these unique geniuses. And I think that I worry that there's a baby out with the bathwater thing. And that just makes me, I think that's intellectually troublesome, but also I think it leaves people actually bereft of authentic spiritual genius, which, we can all benefit from no matter what tradition it comes out of. But Dan, any sort of opening salvo thoughts on?
Yeah, so my thoughts are sort of an extension of what you're saying, and it's that when we're talking about esoteric Christianity, we're talking about esotericism and we're talking about Christianity. And esotericism is repugnant to a lot of Christians for good reasons, because the gospel is simple and clear. All the mysteries are revealed. There's nothing left. And I think that that's one position. I don't necessarily agree with it. Christ speaks in parables, says mysterious things like, greater things than these shall ye do. What are those greater things? When Paul talks about the prince of the power of the air, like, what is that? These are things that, they charge the imagination and they make you ask questions about hidden things. And that is the essence of what the occult or esotericism is about. And so I think esotericism in a way is repugnant to Christians, or to many Christians, not all, or not necessarily, but often. And then Christianity is repugnant to a lot of esotericists who, as you say, come out of these post-Christian milieus, or it can also be other religions. It doesn't necessarily have to be Christianity, but it's usually people who get burned by a religion, who then run in the opposite direction without jettisoning spirituality, but they run into other kinds of religious currents, and that's fine. It's just that those people usually won't be very interested in Renaissance magic or Renaissance esotericism because they have this aversion to anything Christian. And then we were talking about this beforehand. I think there's a lot of people who are just kind of funneled into esotericism from the more spooky left-hand path type stuff. And, horror movies, heavy metal music, the darker side of aesthetic culture, if you will. And I think that a lot of that informs why people would have an aversion to Renaissance esotericism. But at the same time, those people are into everything Gothic. And this, to me, in a way, ties into a lot of that stuff. So it is perplexing somewhat. But again, I ask you the question then, what about the Solomonic material, which is
same time period.
Some of the most popular material is Christian, but is orders of magnitude more popular in terms of popular imagination. So what do you think the cause of that is?
Right. And again, it's intensely Christian, and it's roughly from the same time period people basically forget. With the exception of some stuff in the Ars Notoria, most of the Solomonic stuff is introduced into Italy at the same time that the Hermetica and stuff is actually. So they're actually in many ways roughly contemporaneous, weirdly enough, in terms of their appearance or whatever. I think that maybe there are a couple of things. One is just historiography in terms of the historiography of what people have access to. It's just that the 20th century was dominated by Wicca and Aleister Crowley and Thelema, and the kinds of texts that the Golden Dawn and the Thelema prioritized were these Goetic kinds of texts. They're available in cheap paperbacks. They're 100 pages long with a bunch of pictures, and that's not the Heptaplus. I mean, the Heptaplus is a huge volume. It's very difficult to even get an English translation. Get your hands on an English translation for less than $400. The Platonic Theology is 6 volumes long. There's a reason why the Corpus Hermeticum is really popular and the 900 Theses isn't.
Yeah.
It's just there's an accessibility issue when it comes to this stuff. And I think that many esotericists, because they've been burned by Christianity, there's a desire to get like power and stuff. And it's not surprising that the Goetia and other kinds of texts are all about acquiring stuff, like, stuff like getting power or things, fame or fortune or whatever. Like if you look at the occult Reddit, there's so many requests to, how do I get in touch with Paimon to like get to this or get to that or do whatever. And of course, Crowley psychologized a lot of that stuff to make it about spiritual development and things like that. But I think a lot of people really get into it because they feel disempowered and they want stuff. And if they can use magic to get it, they'll do it. So I think that that's 2 parts of it. I think a third part of it is just that, and we were talking about this earlier, it's just that Renaissance esotericism, a bit like even Hermetic spirituality of the late classical world, the results are in the contemplation. Simplicator.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Like there is no promise of, like, for instance, there's no promise of wealth or fame. In fact, wealth and fame are impediments to that inward journey of the mind, or the flight of the alone to the alone. It's the flight of the alone to the alone. It's not the flight of you got fame and fortune and a demon wife to sleep with you to the
in a pocket plane.
Yeah. That's just not it's an intellectual spiritual ascent in which the act of contemplation is at some level the accomplishment of itself. And that's it. That's the end of it. And that's even true in Agrippa, which I think is, again, why Agrippa is also an extension of this, just with a lot of really spooky pictures and cool alphabets and stuff like that. But at the end of it, it really is about rejoining the Godhead and enjoying divine union and things like that. And it's part of the spiritual ascent. So I think it's what propels people into esotericism is going to determine what's going to be interesting, and what's going to be interesting is actually a function of what's accessible to them. And a lot of the Renaissance stuff is huge books that don't promise you anything aside from a spiritual ascent, very much in a Christian context. And given all of that, I think that it just stands in stark contrast to the very consumeristic 20th century. I want all this stuff, and I can either get it on the stock market or I can use magic or whatever. So I think there's just a very different mentality that's difficult to comprehend, and it's just really hard. Reading the Platonic theology, I don't know about you, Dan, it's a slog to me. Reading
Oh, it's
16 different arguments about the immortality of soul, it's like, God, Ficino, this is just hard. And I'm supposed to be on your team, man. So in that way, it's just super tough, even for people who want to do it, much less for someone who just like wants to pray to a Enochian angel to get a girlfriend or something. It's a much more different. It's a mountain to climb.
I run the Ficino
So that was a long thing.
Twitter. So
Oh,
I
yeah.
run the Ficino Twitter. So I'm often just like digging through his works, looking for random quotes, because it's usually like out of context stuff. I mean, I'll find something that's usually worthy of meditating on at the very least. But often it's usually I crack open a random work of Ficino's and then just select a quote and post it, as long as it makes sense on its own and it's not, depending on some previous sentence for context or whatever. And whenever I crack open the Platonic theology, I'm like, man, somebody sat through this and translate. I mean, that somebody being Allen and Hankins. They sat through and translated all 13 volumes of this stuff. And I can tell, like, that's a labor of love, because that's so much time and energy and like attention to detail and having to be familiar. They say that Ficino expressly avoids using scholastic terms, but he is debating scholastic concepts in his own language. And so you have to reverse engineer his Platonic language to understand the scholastic ideas that he's getting at. And it must just be a nightmare of translation. So I commend them and I'm grateful to them. But I don't envy them. Even just translating the De Christiana Religione, which is coming out this month. That's that in and of itself was kind of dry at times when you're getting into the biblical exegesis and he's quoting Bible passage after Bible passage at you. That's not the same stuff that's in the Platonic theology, but this is the companion work to the Platonic theology. And I couldn't imagine if it were 6 times the length.
No, I'm in awe of the folks like you that do that work. It's always easy for me doing esoterica stuff because I can, I can just skim down the Latin until I get to the part that I need to make the episode. Then I have to unpack that, but it's never going to be more than a couple, 2 or 3 pages, and it's never a rigorous translation. I'm like, okay, I know what he's arguing here, but it's another thing to have to publish that stuff. But
well, we were imprisoned for 2 years, so
that's true. Yeah, you were all monks.
That is quite literally what we did during that time. Was every day we worked on it
in
for
your
at least 3 hours. So it's done now.
I hope you earn your merit in the world to come.
I feel weird about advertising this book. Like I want people to know about it, and this is what I've been working about. But also, like, I'm not necessarily preaching the ideas that are in it, and so it feels strange to be the translator of something and want people to read it and be interested in it and have the same kind of fascination that you had. But it's also weird to advertise these things when you know that some of the content isn't very savory.
Yeah, but I think I think you're not advertising it as a thing to believe, but it as a part of an edifice of a spiritual history and a philosophical history of the West that
and understanding a guy.
Yeah. That it's just part of the task of adding another piece to the puzzle of a much larger arc of human knowledge. So yeah, I don't think any sane person wants to double down on a militant Agrippaist. I don't want to be around that person.
I don't think Agrippa is a militant Agrippa.
No, that's true. But yeah, I can't imagine someone just really doubling down on being an Agrippa purist. or whatever. And not even he would reject that, like you said. Um, but no, it's an interesting kind of problem. This accessibility to Renaissance um, mysticism and to Renaissance esotericism, and I also like, I guess I'll also blame Pico, and it's not totally his fault because he died or he was assassinated, but um, the 900 Conclusions are not easy reading in terms of, though that's not true. They're actually very easy reading. They're just incredibly difficult to understand what in the world he's actually getting at, and that has a lot to do with the kind of education you would need to understand, to pack up, to unpack what is it about Averroism, or what is it about Pseudo Dionysius, or what is it about the Liber de Causis, or whatever that he's trying to mine out of. And if you've never heard of the Liber de Causis, then that's just a blind alley basically that you've managed to walk into. But I think part of it, and again, this is not helped by the farmer text, which kind of makes a weird argument about how Pico's a syncretist, which in many ways he isn't. But the Copenhaver text is just mammoth. Like, I've read through chunks of it, and I don't know how long it would. Have you read the whole thing?
The Magic and the Dignity of Man?
Yeah.
3 times.
3 times. Well, I guess it's maybe a big part of your diss when you.
Huge part. Well, because it's the most important work in Pico studies that has come out since anybody else's work on Pico. Right. And so you have to, if you were to ignore it, you would just be shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
And working with a bunch of half-baked ideas of people who misunderstood Pico. Right. Whereas Brian Copenhaver has kind of rehabilitated the field. And then Sophia Howlett recently wrote a book called Reevaluating Pico. Mm-hmm. And that also kind of works in the light of the new Copenhaver book. So she did a book on Ficino, and then she did a book on Pico, and now she's doing a book on Bruno. And it's kind of a trilogy of these 3 thinkers who were highlighted in Francis Yates, Giordano Bruno, and the Hermetic tradition, but reevaluated from beyond the Yates paradigm. So that's a really important work that she's doing. And I think that Copenhaver is playing a big role in that reassessment.
Right. And I think that's another thing to go back on, thinking about what is living and what is dead in Renaissance esotericism, to crib somebody. And to think about how alive Bruno is for many people, that Bruno is this character that is getting, there are retranslations of Bruno happening now, of De Magia and other texts. I was talking with a gentleman who's really interested on the art of memory, and he's big into Bruno. It's interesting that Bruno, I think, has managed to jump out of all this, in a way that, the other folks haven't, Reuchlin and other folks haven't. And I wonder how much of that has to do with it has to do with Yates and how she so centered him, and maybe has caused us to misunderstand Bruno in a pretty significant historical light, at least in some ways. Certainly if Hanegraaff and other folks are right, in which I think they largely are, but I have some sympathy for the Yates paradigm in some ways. And 2, just the events of Bruno's life, people they just like him. He's just this crazy, arrogant, maverick.
What's the martyr of modernity thing?
Yeah, right. Which is totally, yeah.
It's played up, right? Right. He wasn't a martyr of modernity. He was a martyr of his own pig-headedness in a way.
In a way, yeah. And most of the things he got martyred for, most people are certainly not going to go to the pyre for now. People. It wasn't the infinite world stuff that really got him killed. It was Marian heresy and stuff.
Trinitarianism stuff.
Yeah, it's Trinitarian stuff. It's classic getting yourself burned in the Middle Ages stuff. And
the same kind of stuff that Pico would get in trouble for.
Right. Yeah, there's a pretty people forget that the Roman Inquisition had a really narrow scope of what it beefed about. And it really, otherwise, outside of that stuff, you had a lot of latitude in the Roman Inquisition. But
and that Bruno was a Dominican.
That's true too. That's helped.
A big part of it is that he was a rogue Dominican.
Right.
Those are the people that
they're the people who are supposed to be
looking out for.
Right. They're the very people who are supposed to make the Inquisition work. And you get a rogue one, and that's terrifying. he goes Sith or whatever. But yeah, I think that Bruno somehow survive. But I think also Bruno's one of these people that's more celebrated than Red. It'd be my guess. I'm thinking people to. I'm wondering how many people
He's an
are.
Italian national hero as well, and there's a lot of
That's
that
true,
too.
right?
Which I assume a lot of people who go visit. I mean, to say nothing of the people who live in Italy, but people who go visit Italy, Anglosphere people come back, enjoy this kind of Renaissance figure, this Magus, who is, very he tickles the imagination for a lot of people because he was against the current and also part of this age of discovery
Right.
with Galileo and all of these figures.
Right. And also his books have these really nice titles that I think are like when you name your book on the Christian religion, people are like,
Yeah,
right. Or
I allude to how bland the title is in our introduction.
yeah, like on the 900 Theses. But yeah, when your book is on the shadow of ideas or something, you're like, okay, this sounds like weird magic stuff. Let's do this.
Yeah, we're just on magic.
Yeah, just on magic, which there are a couple of those books as well. But that's really just a long essay. If you get into the text, it's really not.
Yeah, there's a lot of categorizing.
Like, it's actually not that great of an essay.
Fire is pyromancy. Magic
right,
with water is hydromancy.
Yeah, I think I've always told people it would function far better as a infographic than it would as a book.
Oh, that's a good point.
And so I've always looked at De Magia, and there is some theory in there a little bit, but it's mostly just. But you find those exact same lists in Martin Del Rio and a lot of these other heresiologists, where they go through every form of magic and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, it's one of these texts that again sounds sexy, but when you put it into its historical context, you're like, yeah, we've seen this already.
Yeah.
So
Giordano Bruno has also gotten a lot of public media coverage.
Right, there are books and
Neil
mystery
deGrasse
novels
Tyson, Magic School Bus for Adults thing about Giordano Bruno, which played into the whole myth,
right?
Because it serves his purposes. And what else? I'm pretty sure Carl Sagan himself had a bit on Giordano Bruno in the original Cosmos.
Mm-hmm. I think there's even series of novels about him actually at this point.
There's a movie in Italian, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know, awesome, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah, there should be more movies. I mean, there's not an Agrippa movie blows my. I mean, yeah.
All these guys.
Yeah, all these guys. I mean, Pico and all these. Yeah, I wish there were 16 Robert Eggers out there, and they could all just be dedicated to making period pieces on Renaissance and early modern weirdos, and there could be a cottage industry of that or something. But I don't think
just take the I Claudius model. You don't need fancy sets or costumes or really anything. You just need good actors and good dialogue.
Yeah. I think it would be people would do well by it. Or it would be really interesting at least. All these characters. I'm always happy to a random John Dee cameo in some movie about Elizabeth. I'm like, there he is. But no movie on Dee. Any other thoughts? Sort of last thoughts as we kind of wrap up. The Renaissance esotericism stuff. How about this? This is maybe an interesting thing we can wrap up on. Dan, you're really an expert in this field. Where would, if someone wanted to hear out our concern that people aren't taking Renaissance esotericism maybe as seriously as they could, and it would really benefit them, where would be the book that you would go to as your entry, or maybe the 2 or 3 books where you would point people to and say, if you want an entry into the world of Renaissance esotericism, what would be the kind of text that you would recommend, even if they have to be the 500 page or 800 page Copenhagen text that does have the cool illustrations of Pico's understanding of the Sephiroth, folks. Does have that.
The problem with this is that there is what I would suggest for scholarship, and then there is what I would suggest for people who are just interested in it for practical reasons. Because for scholarship, I would probably recommend, you can do no better than Hanegraaff's Esotericism in the Academy. I think it just kind of gives you a who's who along the way of all these major figures and their thoughts from a critical historical perspective that slots them chronologically in a cohesive narrative that you can read from, I think, the period that Frances Yates began in her study onward. So that's what I would recommend for the scholar. But that's obviously, a lot of people would pick up that book looking to get something out of it and might get nothing because it's so dense and historiographical and theoretical, and it's all about these like concepts like Platonic Orientalism and defining esotericism. And I think that's not what a lot of people are after. For that, go get Agrippa. That's really, or Barrett is another one. You could do the Barrett stuff, since a lot of it is ripped off of Agrippa, but that's much later. It's like from the 1800s.
Right.
But I think probably getting familiarized with Agrippa, and then the advice I give is to spiral out, is to pick what really interests you, and then to go forward in time and backward in time in terms of who elaborated this work and who was formative to this work. And then you can just build up this small kind of understanding from the inside out, working with these different authors. And it doesn't have to be Agrippa, it could be the Picatrix or something like that. Because remember, the Picatrix started floating around Europe in the 1450s. Right. In the Latin form. It was translated in the 13th century, but it really didn't make much of an appearance until around this time during the Renaissance. And that's why we have people like Reuchlin writing against it,
right.
Or decrying it, or trying to give an alternative kind of magic. So if you're into the practical stuff, I would recommend looking into Agrippa or the Picatrix. And if you're into the theoretical stuff, from an academic point of view, I would say pick up maybe Hanegraaff or Antoine Favre's book on esotericism, which has been translated into English, I'm pretty sure.
The Access to Modern Esotericism?
Yeah.
I think that was one of the first books I ever read on esotericism.
Like the Hanegraaff crew and all of the Amsterdam people, they have so many books, and honestly, just read like 3 or 4 of those and you'll be started. They're all good. They're just more for people looking at things historiographically than practically, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with the admonition to read Agrippa. And I wish there were a version of Agrippa that had no illustrations in it.
Really? Does he not have any in the original?
Oh, he does. Then he does. But I think that the illustrations, they're obviously they're helps as illustrations, but they make the book much more like a Harry Potter volume, where you treat it as a coffee table book as opposed to a work on a systematic account of the function of occult forces in reality. And I think that part of why I like reading Agrippa is that I think of it as a kind of Summa Magica. And I think that if you kind of treat the book like a coffee table book and just flip around to look at the weird pictures and stuff, some of which we don't know what they mean, by the way. There are whole pictures in there that have numbers in there that no one's ever deciphered. And Agrippa kind of sloppily was in charge of some of the non-text. The Latin is all great, but anytime that there's Hebrew anywhere, it's probably going to be a mess because Agrippa didn't oversee it very well. And people tried to correct it and make it worse every single time that happens. But there's a part of me that wishes there were a version of Agrippa that had almost no illustrations, or only when they were extremely necessary. Because I think that in that way you would treat it like a book and not a coffee table book, because Agrippa's work is very systematic. It builds very carefully from book 1 to book 2 to book 3, and that you can't just skip to ceremonial magic in book 3 and that book make any sense, because Agrippa is just that. He's a much more medieval thinker in many ways than people give him credit for. He's just using a very modern theory of magic, but his mode of progressing through literature, where he just piles on quotations and things like that, is a much more like scholastic way of approaching the topic. And I think that approaching him much more like a medieval thinker, writing a a Disputatione or something than thinking of him as a here's how to do magic, right?
Mhm.
Which that book is that, but only in a very particular kind of way. I think would help people do that. And also, I'll say that people are very lucky now that they have options to read Agrippa that's not in that old James Freak edition, which is
Old JF.
yeah JF Freak or whatever. Yeah, but I would say that the new translations are really 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 great. Um, but yeah, Agrippa is just, and also let him be a Christian. Like, don't try to de-Christify. Like, you don't need to hold your nose if you're not a Christian to appreciate him. I think
Do
you can
people do
appreciate him.
that? I don't know.
I think some people who actually do get that he was a Christian to have to maybe hold their nose a little bit, but I don't know. I've never had the yeah. Don't let that turn you off when he's like, and this will be the supremacy of Christ. I'm like, okay, of course. Like, I don't, But anyway, I would tell people pick up the Purdue translation of the New Agrippa. That's my favorite translation. I think it's the better of the two. Purdue, I think, understands the Latin a good bit better and also understands the text compared, especially to the 1510 edition. So I would say that the Purdue translation, which I have on the shelf, I would pick up. I think you can also get it from him signed for not much more than retail, which means he does get a bit more money. So I'm all about putting money in people's pockets if I can, if I got to buy a book.
Mhm.
All right, Dan. Thank you for your insights. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone else in the chat and who's watching that I really love just sitting down and chatting with you. And again, we get to work through some of these ideas in a way that can otherwise be really isolating. And I hope that these conversations that we get to sort of just impromptu plan on a Sunday or whatever are helpful to folks to deepen their own understanding of this weird literature, and also hopefully deepen folks' spiritual practice and give people accessibility to this content, because at least to me that's the big drive of Esoterica, is an ironically named channel that part of its access is to not be esoteric. It's to make this stuff accessible. So yeah, Dan, thank you for coming on, and thank you for the work of increasing accessibility with your translation work and your wider scholarship. Thank you for that work.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and I enjoy it every time.
Yeah.
I would tell everybody to go check out my 2 Reuchlin videos if you haven't, because I put a lot of work into those. And I mean, to me, I wouldn't say they underperformed. They performed about as well as videos do on my channel. So I'm happy with that. My stuff is more evergreen in nature, I think, or I just the views pile up over the years rather than come and go at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to have those out and done, and look forward to hearing from people and their thoughts on it, and to working on more projects in a similar nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, folks, definitely check out Dan's work over at the Modern Hermeticist on his channel, and his works on Reuchlin. Three videos on Reuchlin are just amazing. And again, check out his Patreon. Support your esoteric content creators. Like we literally use the support we get to keep the lights on and to continue making the content. And we're not getting rich doing it, but it does help to support the work of buying whatever expensive Ficino books we have to buy. So, all right, folks. Well, thank you again so much for tuning in. And later this week, Shabbatites V. I'm going to be covering the theological works of the Shabbatians, at least the pre-apostasy works. So if you're interested in Shabbatites V and you're exhausted with the complete grifter content on Shabbatites V that exists on the internet, then I hope you can come check a look at what we'll be talking about with Nathan of Gaza and some of his texts, including the still untranslated Treatise on the Dragons. So, which again, sexy titles, folks. Treatise on the Dragons, which literally you could translate as Treatise on the Deep Ones, which would be even more Lovecraftianly awesome and still completely Hebrew in terms of the etymology or whatever. So the Treatise on the Dragons, the Treatise on the Deep Ones. So come check that stuff out on Friday, and I'll see folks then. But otherwise, thank you, Dan. Thank you, folks in the chat, and see you guys soon.